The wind didn't just howl. It screamed. It was a living thing, a predator made of ice and speed, and it was tearing Clara Ara's world apart. She stumbled forward, one hand on her fur-lined collar, the other clutching the impossible weight of her own belly. The snow was falling so fast the world was just a blur of white. Behind her, the tracks of the wagon train were already gone. Erased. The voices were gone, too. Just the memory of hooves, curses, and the sound of the lead rider laughing. Rafe's laugh. "You're a burden, Clara Ara," he'd spat, his face twisted in disgust. "Who gets herself knocked up during a raid?" Then he'd turned his horse, cracked the reins, and ridden away. He left her there, sinking in the slush, her heart sinking even faster. He left her to die. Now her boots were soaked through. Useless. The snow beneath her was turning red. A sharp, hot pain ripped up her spine. It felt like a knife made of fire being dragged through her bones. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat glazed her skin, a cruel joke in the freezing air. "It's too soon," she thought. "It's too soon, and I'm too far from anything that matters." She fell to her knees beside a dead birch tree, its bark stripped away by wind and wolves until it looked like a skeleton. A low groan escaped her lips as another contraction rolled through her body like a shockwave. She clamped a hand over her mouth, biting down hard to keep from screaming. There was no one to hear her. And if there was, they wouldn't help. Not anymore. "Don't leave me," she whispered to the snow, her voice hoarse and broken. "Not like this." Night bled across the plains, turning the sky from gray to iron to a deep starless black. The snow fell thicker, heavier, like a shroud. Time lost all meaning. It was just an endless river of pain and cold. And somewhere in that river, Clara Ara gave birth. First one, then another. Two cries shattered the night like cracks in glass. They were thin, desperate, impossibly fragile sounds. With trembling, numb fingers, she tore the hem of her own shirt, wrapping the newborns in the ragged scraps of cloth. She pressed them to her chest, her lips to their tiny, cold foreheads. "We," she murmured to the first, a boy, her voice nearly gone. "Tire," she whispered to the second, a girl. Sun and wind. Their skin was cold, too cold, but they were breathing. She leaned her head back against the birch trunk, her vision swimming in and out of focus. The wind whipped fresh snow over her legs, burying her. Her fingers were stiff, purple. Her heartbeat slowed. Thump, thump, thump. Far away, a wolf howled. The sound carried across the empty land like a curse. Clara Ara closed her eyes. The rider came from the north. He moved like a shadow against the snow, silent and dark. He rode without a hurry in his posture, but his eyes missed nothing. He saw the shattered tracks of wagon wheels. He saw the faint drag marks of a woman's boots. And then he saw the red in the snow. It was still fresh. Wicasa dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He stepped through the wind as if it were a physical thing he had to push aside. A rifle was strapped across his back, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. Under the birch tree, a woman lay slumped sideways. Her skin had the waxy blue-gray color of the half-dead. Tucked under her torn coat were two tiny bundles, their little chests rising and falling in a slow, shallow rhythm. He crouched beside them. The woman's lips were cracked and bleeding. Her face was streaked with blood, dirt, and the salt from her own tears. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, stabbed through him. His sister, Angatu, lying in the ash after the miners burned their winter lodge. He had sworn an oath that day. Never again would he lift a hand for the ones who carried gunpowder and greed into his people's land. Let them kill each other. Let them burn. But now, these babies, this mother, the same snow, a different choice. One of the infants whimpered, a sharp thread-like cry that cut through the wind. For a single heartbeat, The world went silent. Wakasa closed his eyes and breathed out, slow and long. Then he moved. He pulled off his own buffalo hide cloak, a heavy, warm thing that smelled of smoke and pine. He wrapped it tightly around the newborns, covering their feet, their ears, their tiny mouths from the biting air. His hands were sure, practiced. He slid one arm under Clara Ara's back, the other beneath her knees, and lifted her. She was a dead weight in his arms. She didn't stir. Life, he murmured under his breath, a word that was half prayer, half command. He gave a low whistle, and his horse stepped forward, steam rising from its flared nostrils. With incredible care, he placed Clara Ara across the saddle, making sure the children were held securely against her chest by the heavy cloak. Then he mounted behind her, steadying them all with one strong arm. The wind rose again, shrieking like a ghost across the ridgeline. For a second, the horizon burned orange, and then it was black again. He glanced to the west, where the smoke from the old mining camp still curled into the sky like a snake, a threat. He turned his horse east, toward home, toward the winter camp. The Lakota camp was nestled in a narrow valley, protected from the worst of the wind by 2 forested hills. As he rode in, the camp dogs barked, a low, alert sound. A few heads turned, then more. Eyes widened in disbelief. Wakasa said nothing. He simply dismounted, carrying the unconscious woman and the 2 bundled infants in his arms. The elder, Nokomis, stepped forward to meet him. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, and her eyes were as sharp as flint. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice dry as autumn leaves. "No one," Wakasa replied. "But they're not dead. Not yet." Nokomis stared at the tiny, still bundles, then back at him. "You bring fire into snow," she said, her voice laced with warning, "and you expect it not to melt something." "I expect nothing," he said. She nodded once, a short, sharp movement. "Then let's see who survives the night." Inside a low tent, warmed by a small fire and the scent of burning herbs, Clara Ara lay wrapped in soft deer hides. Her chest barely rose. Wee and Tyre rested beside her, small as a breath, their skin slowly pinking in the gentle heat. And Nokomis dabbed broth at Clara Ara's cracked lips with a feather. "She may not wake," the elder warned Wakasa, who stood just inside the flap. "But she has claws. She fought the storm and won." Outside, the wind howled again, but inside, there was only the crackle of the fire. Wakasa stepped back out into the cold. He stood alone by the main fire pit, letting the falling snow melt on his shoulders. His eyes were fixed on the tent where the woman he had no reason to save was fighting for her life. Not for her, he muttered again to himself, to the spirits, to the wind, for the ones who don't know hate yet. Behind him, in the warmth of the tent, Nokomis muttered a prayer, and the children stirred in their sleep. The first thing Clara Ara felt was heat, not the gentle warmth of sunlight, but a dense, smoky heat that clung to her skin and burned the back of her throat. She coughed, a dry, racking sound, and pulled the heavy hide closer around her. Then she froze. "The babies!" The words were a gasp. She tried to sit up, but her body screamed in protest. A bolt of pain shot through her, so sharp it drove the air from her lungs, and she fell back onto the soft furs. She forced her eyes open. The world was dim, wrapped in shadows that danced on leather walls. A small fire crackled in a shallow pit nearby, sending smoke funneling up through a hole in the ceiling. The air smelled of cedar, sage, and something else. Cooked roots. She turned her head slowly. They were there. Wee and Tyre, wrapped in soft, clean skins, sleeping beside her. One had a tiny fist balled up against his cheek. The other shifted, making a soft sound like wind through dry leaves. They were alive. Clara Ara swallowed the sob that rose in her throat. You may look broken, a voice said, cutting through the quiet like a shard of ice. But broken things have sharp edges. Clara Ara flinched, her whole body tensing. In the darkest corner of the tent, a figure moved. A young woman stepped into the firelight. She was tall, with a single braid as thick as a rope hanging over her shoulder, tiny beads woven into the strands. Her face was striking, all sharp angles and unreadable planes, but it was her eyes that held Clara Ara captive. They were hard, clear, and unwavering. The woman crouched by the fire, stirring something in a clay bowl. "Where?" Clara Ara rasped, her throat raw. "You're in the Lakota winter camp," the woman said. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it wasn't gentle either. It was just a fact. "You shouldn't be." Clara Ara tried to sit up again, slower this time. Every muscle protested, but she managed to brace herself on one elbow. "I didn't ask to be brought here." "No," the woman agreed, not looking up from her bowl. "You just showed up, bleeding to death, with children that were never meant to survive the night. But they did. So now we have to deal with you." Clara Ara frowned, confusion mixing with her fear. "Who are you?" "Mika," she said shortly. "My brother died 2 winters ago, a bullet made by a white traitor, so don't expect me to smile." Clara Ara looked away, a fresh wave of shame washing over her. Mika stood and placed the bowl beside Clara Ara. "It's corn mash with sweet root. Eat it. You'll need your strength." Clara Ara didn't move. Her hands instinctively tightened around the sleeping babies. "I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice low. "I just want to leave as soon as I'm strong enough." Mika shrugged, a gesture of complete indifference. "Good. No one here wants you to stay." She turned to leave, then paused at the tent flap, her back to Clara Ara. "But if you want to survive until then," she said over her shoulder, "you need to understand something. Around here, you don't learn the language, you earn it." The flap dropped closed behind her, plunging the tent back into dim silence. Clara Ara didn't eat. Not yet. She waited until the babies began to stir. Then she dipped her own fingers into the warm mash and pressed it gently to their tiny lips. They suckled weakly. It wasn't much, but for now it was enough. Later, the tent flap opened again. This time it was an older woman. Her face was carved with deep lines, like riverbeds etched into stone, and her gray hair was braided with dark feathers. She moved slowly, but with the quiet authority of someone who saw everything. "I am Nokomis," she said softly, her eyes on Clara Ara. "You're still alive. That is something." Clara Ara nodded weakly. "Thank you." Nokomis didn't acknowledge her thanks. Instead, she checked the babies with experienced, gentle hands. "Their names." "We," Clara Ara whispered, touching the boy. "Tyre," she said, her finger tracing the girl's cheek. The elder tilted her head. "Sun and wind. Strong names." She said nothing more. She simply left a fresh hide and a carved bone spoon beside the fire before leaving as silently as she had come. Clara Ara closed her eyes, listening to the wind whistling outside. It sounded like a warning. This place was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. There were no voices of comfort, no words of welcome. There was only survival. The next morning, or what she guessed was morning, she heard footsteps outside the tent, several sets, then silence. The flap was pulled open, and a man stood silhouetted in the doorway, his shadow stretching long and dark against the snow beyond. It was him, the rider. His face was unpainted, marked only by the cold and time. His hair was long, tied back with a leather cord. He wore a simple leather vest over his bare chest, and his eyes, they were dark, still, like deep water just before a storm. Clara Ara sat up straighter, every muscle in her body instantly tense. "You," she said, her voice rough. "You carried me here." He nodded once. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. He stepped into the tent and gently placed a small bundle of dry pine branches near the fire. "Heat," he said, his voice a low rumble. He turned to leave. "Wait," she said, the word escaping before she could stop it. He looked back over his shoulder. "Why did you help me? Why didn't you just leave me to die like the others did?" He looked down at the twins. One of them made a soft, breathy sound in its sleep. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. "Because they didn't ask to be born in the middle of a war," he said quietly. And then he was gone. Clara Ara was left staring into the flames, her mind reeling. No one here was going to make it easy for her. That much was brutally clear. But he hadn't walked away. He had carried her. He had saved them. That had to mean something. Later that day, Camus returned. She brought a set of folded hides and a new flask of water. She checked the twins again, her touch efficient and sure. "Tonight you move," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Move? Where?" "To another tent, closer to the women. We will not have you sleeping in his lodge again." Clara Ara blinked. "His lodge?" Comus arched a single gray eyebrow. "He brought you in, but Wicasa keeps no guests. He also keeps no lies. Be careful what you ask of him." Before Clara Ara could ask what that meant, the elder was gone. That evening, Clara Ara stepped outside for the first time. She wrapped herself and the twins in a borrowed cloth, her steps slow, her knees shaking with weakness. But she had to move. She had to prove she wasn't helpless. The cold air bit at her cheeks. Smoke curled from the tops of other tents. She could hear the faint echo of children's laughter from somewhere she couldn't see. She turned and saw him, Wicasa. He was near the edge of the village, kneeling beside a small fire, sharpening a long, wicked-looking blade with steady, even strokes. He looked up, and for a long moment their eyes met across the snowy ground. He didn't smile, he didn't frown, but he didn't look away either. The next morning, Clara Ara woke to find a small carved object left just outside her new tent. It was a wooden eagle, its wings spread wide, its talons open. It wasn't a threat. It felt more like a symbol, maybe a warning, or maybe a choice. As she held the carving in her hand, Mika entered without knocking, as was her way. This time she didn't just drop something and leave. She sat down beside the fire. "You want to stay alive?" she asked, her voice blunt. Clara Ara looked up from the eagle, her heart thumping. "Then listen," Mika said. "Around here, survival isn't about what you carry in your hands. It's about what you prove with them." She tossed a strip of dried meat into Clara Ara's lap. "Tomorrow you learn how to make a fire. After that, no one feeds you." Clara Ara stared into the flames, her knuckles white as she gripped the small wooden eagle. Tomorrow she would either make fire, or she and her children would freeze. It was as simple and as terrifying as that. The cold was a constant presence now. It wasn't just in the air. It was a second skin Clara Ara couldn't peel off. It lived deep in her bones. She was awake before the sun, her fingers stiff, her lips cracked. Her back ached from a sleep that never went deep enough to offer any real rest. The first thing she did, every single morning, was check on Wee and Tyre. They were still breathing, two small, warm bundles between her and the fire pit. Her heart always caught in her throat until she saw their tiny chests rise and fall. Only then could she move. Mika had kept her word. No one brought food that day. No one brought water. No one offered a single word. The silence from the rest of the camp was a heavy blanket. It wasn't filled with active hate, just a quiet, constant judgment. A watchfulness. She stepped outside, and the frigid air sliced into her lungs like tiny knives. The sun was a pale smear behind gray clouds, but the camp was already stirring. Figures moved between lodges, smoke curled toward the sky, and dogs paced between the frozen footprints in the snow. Clara Ara clutched the baby sling tight across her chest, the twins tucked securely inside. She walked toward the center of the camp, where a group of women were squatting near baskets of firewood and wrapped roots. One of them noticed her and quickly looked away. Another simply turned her back. Mika was there, crouched over a pile of dry branches. She didn't even look up when she spoke. "You want to eat? You help." Clara Ara nodded and sat down in the snow. Her fingers fumbled with the fire-starting tools Mika pushed toward her, a pointed stick and a block of cedar. She knew nothing of this kind of fire. No matches, no flint, just pressure and friction, and a patience she didn't think she possessed. She tried to mimic the woman beside her, who was grinding her stick into the cedar block with a practiced, hypnotic rhythm. Clara Ara tried. She failed. She tried again. A wisp of smoke rose, then vanished. Her hands cramped. A low growl of frustration escaped her lips, and she slammed the wood down harder, but the stick only splintered. The woman beside her snorted. "Anger doesn't cook meat," she said in Lakota accented English. Mika finally looked up, her dark eyes pinning Clara Ara in place. "If you want to survive here," she said, repeating her earlier warning, "you don't learn the language. You earn it." Clara Ara met her gaze without flinching. "So teach me." Mika paused, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, in her eyes. Then, with the barest hint of a smile, she gestured for Clara Ara to hand her the tools. "Watch." The lesson was slow, repetitive, and agonizing, but Clara Ara learned. She learned to twist the stick not with brute force, but with rhythm, with pressure, with patience, and with a strange kind of trust in the wood itself. By noon, she had coaxed a glowing red coal out of the cedar. By dusk, she had a fire. We cried while she worked. Tyre fussed. Her back screamed in protest. But when the smoke finally thickened and a tiny flame caught, she felt something shift. Not in the wood, in her chest. One of the older women, the one who had snorted at her earlier, walked over and handed her a strip of dried rabbit meat. She didn't smile, but she gave a single sharp nod. Clara Ara nodded back, too exhausted to speak. That night, she sat outside her tent, the babies tucked warm at her side. The camp buzzed softly with low singing and the sound of crackling fires. Wicasa walked past, carrying a bundle of furs. She watched him go but didn't call out. He paused anyway. He crouched beside her small, hard-won fire without a word. She offered him no thanks. He hadn't spoken to her in days, not since he'd left the eagle carving. He pulled a small stick from his coat, a tool for drawing in the coals and ash. In the dirt beside her fire, he drew a word. He pointed to the wind whistling through the pines. "Tate," he said. Clara Ara frowned. The name she had given her daughter. Tyre. He pointed at the word, then at the wind again. "Tate," she tried the sound. "Tay," he corrected her softly. "Ta-tai." She repeated it. He nodded. Then he touched his own chest. "Wicasa." "I know," she said. He hesitated, then wrote another word in the dirt. "Fire." She said it, her mouth clumsy with the unfamiliar sounds. "Peta." His mouth twitched, the closest she'd ever seen him come to a smile. "Close enough." "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Why are you teaching me this?" He didn't look at her. He just pointed toward the sleeping babies. "Because one day," he said, "you will need to name the world for them." He stood and walked away, disappearing into the night without another word. Clara Ara didn't sleep much that night. She rolled the new words over in her mind, again and again, like smooth stones in her palm. Tate, Peta, Wicasa. The next morning she tried them out loud, just to herself, just to the twins. The words didn't feel like they belonged to her yet. But they were seeds, and seeds grow. Days turned into a week, The air warmed slightly. It was still bitter, still deadly, but no longer fatal with every single breath. Clara Ara worked with the women. She learned to scrape hides, to brew root tea, to carve sharp needles from bone. She wasn't good at it, not yet, but she tried. She never complained. She never asked for help. Wicasa continued his silent lessons. He didn't speak to her often, but he would return at night with a new word each time, drawn in the dirt by the firelight. Water, sun, family. She etched them into her memory, whispering them into Tyre's ear when the little girl couldn't sleep. One evening, as she struggled to adjust the sling across her aching shoulder, she fumbled and dropped Wheeze Wrap. The boy let out a wail of protest. Before she could even bend down to reach for it, Wicasa was there. His hands were faster, steadier, and far gentler than she would have expected. He lifted the baby and tucked him back into the sling with a practiced, easy care. Clara Ara blinked, stunned. "You've done this before." His face became an unreadable mask. She realized her mistake too late. Maybe he had. Maybe once. And maybe not anymore. Another week passed. The snow began to melt into slush. The air smelled of damp soil and fresh pine. Children splashed in shallow puddles during the warmer midday hours. Dogs barked at squirrels emerging from their winter dens. Then one morning, Clara Ara found something new beside her tent. Not just a carved eagle, but a strip of beaded cloth, red and white. It wasn't a welcome, not exactly. But it was a sign she was no longer forgotten. That evening, while stirring a bubbling stew, Clara Ara quietly asked Mika, "Why are you helping me now?" Mika shrugged, not looking up from her own pot. "You haven't begged, not once. That's something." She stirred for a moment, then added, "Besides, the old ones say that if a child survives a storm, they were born for a purpose. You have too." That night, as Clara Ara sat by her fire, Wicasa returned from the woods with a rabbit slung over his shoulder. He paused, then crouched beside her as he now often did. He took a coal from the fire and drew a shape in the dirt. A spiral. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low and serious. "You come to the center." Clara Ara narrowed her eyes. "What for?" His expression didn't change. "Fire is not just for warmth. It is for ceremony." She stared at him, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. "A ceremony for what?" He stood, his tall frame blocking out the stars. "For choosing." That night, just as Clara Ara was drifting into an uneasy sleep, Mika entered her tent. She dropped a folded cloth into Clara Ara's lap. "Wear this," she said. Clara Ara opened it. It was a dress of soft buckskin, simple but clean, stitched along the edges with red thread. "For the ceremony?" she asked. Mika nodded. "Everyone stands in the circle," she said, her voice unusually low. "But not everyone is seen." The fire in the center of the camp wasn't just a blaze. It was alive. It hissed and snapped as dusk bled into night, spitting sparks into the wind like whispered secrets climbing toward the sky. The Lakota gathered around it in a wide, sacred circle. Women with their braids tied high, men with faces painted for ceremony, eagle feathers pinned to their vests. Children sat quietly on furs, their eyes wide and reflecting the dancing flames as the drumming began. It was a low, steady sound, older than words. Clara Ara stood at the edge of the circle, clutching the twins close inside her sling. The buckskin dress Mika had given her felt strange against her skin. It was soft and clean, too light for the cold night, but far too heavy with a meaning she didn't understand. Beside her, Mika tightened her own shawl. "Don't speak unless you're spoken to," she muttered. "Don't step forward unless you're called." Clara Ara nodded, her mouth dry. Wicasa was already there, standing among the outer ring of warriors. His face was bare, no paint, no mask. He held something in his hands, wrapped in a simple cloth. Nkomis sat near the fire, her back straight as an arrow, a thin strand of smoke from her pipe curling around her head. The elder's presence alone was enough to hush the restless crowd. Then the chief stepped forward. He was old, powerful, with eyes like chipped flint. His name was Winga, and he did not waste words. "This is the night of Wakapia," he said, his voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. "The fire that chooses, the circle that binds. Who among you steps forward?" For a moment, no one moved. Then a man crossed the invisible line into the circle. He held a small, beautifully carved wolf in his hands. He placed it carefully beside the fire and turned to face a young woman across the flames. She nodded once. Others followed. Each man brought a carving, a turtle, a bison, a bear, and placed it near the fire. It wasn't a gift, not a prize. It was a declaration. This is where I stand. This is who I choose. Clara'ara's heart pounded harder with every offering. She was suddenly painfully aware of every stare, every whispered word, every rustle of breath around her. She was an outsider, a ghost at their sacred fire. Then Wicasa stepped into the circle. The crowd went silent. The drumming stopped. In his hands he held a small eagle, wings outstretched, carved from a single piece of ash wood. Its feathers were marked with ochre and coal, simple but precise. Clara'ara recognized it instantly. It was the one he had left outside her tent. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak to the crowd. He faced the chief. Winga raised a brow. "You bring fire from the outside, Wicasa. What do you seek in this flame?" Wicasa looked him directly in the eye. "I did not bring you a white woman," he said. His voice was calm, measured, but it was loud enough for every single person in the circle to hear. "I did not bring a stranger." Murmurs rippled through the crowd like a sudden wind. Wicasa let the silence hang for a heartbeat, then he said, "I did not bring anyone. I brought my family." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so thick, so full, Clara'ara felt like she was drowning in it. Her breath caught in her throat. Her ears were ringing. My family. No one moved. Even the fire seemed to go still. Then the spell was broken by the sound of footsteps. It was Mika. She walked away from Clara'ara's side, weaving through the seated elders, until she disappeared into the deep shadows at the edge of the camp. Winga said nothing. He simply gave Wicasa a single, slow nod. Wicasa placed the carved eagle beside the others and stepped back, rejoining the outer ring of warriors as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Clara'ara stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The fire danced wildly now, sending smoke spiraling up to the stars. A few eyes turned to her, curious, confused, some quietly furious. The ceremony continued, but she barely saw it. She couldn't feel her fingers, not from the cold, but from the crushing weight of that single moment. Later, when the crowd began to thin and the drumming softened to a gentle pulse, Clara'ara sat by her own small fire, feeding Tyre with shaking hands. The baby's tiny lips clung to the cloth, as if it held the last bit of warmth in the world. The flap of her tent rustled. She didn't look up right away. She expected Wicasa, but it wasn't him. It was a figure she hadn't seen in weeks. A ghost she thought was buried under the snow. He was tall, slouched, wrapped in a tattered old military coat. He pressed one arm tightly against his ribs. His face was thinner than she remembered, gaunt, and a long, ugly scar now crossed his cheek. Her blood turned to ice. Rafe. The man who had left her to die. The man who had laughed as the wagon rolled away. Behind him, two more men stood in the shadows. One was limping badly, the other held his arm at a strange angle, his face bruised and swollen. They weren't part of the tribe. They looked like they weren't part of anything anymore. "Clara," Rafe rasped. "Thank God." She rose slowly, her body stiff, her voice coming out low and numb. "What are you doing here?" We were ambushed, bandits. They took everything. We barely made it out alive, he said, stepping closer. We began to cry, disturbed by the new voice. I thought you were dead, Rafe added, and his eyes glinted in the firelight. Guess you're tougher than you look. Clara Ara's fists clenched at her sides. You left me, she whispered, the words like poison on her tongue. I made a bad call, all right? I was panicked. We all were. Look, we're starving. We need help. Suddenly, there were voices behind her. Wicasa, Mika, others. They were approaching quickly, weapons drawn, their faces grim. Clara Ara raised a hand, her voice suddenly clear and strong. Don't kill them. Wicasa stepped to her side, his eyes never leaving the intruders. They followed the smoke, he said, his voice dangerously low. They will bring more trouble. Clara Ara turned to him. Then we don't give them a reason to. She looked from Rafe to the broken shells of the other men. They could barely stand. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were just ghosts. Wicasa's jaw tightened. Winga approached, the crowd forming a silent circle around them once more. What do you ask? The chief demanded, his gaze on Clara Ara. Clara Ara stood tall, the firelight casting her shadow long behind her. They left me to die, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she had. But I will not return the favor. The tribe argued for hours, but in the end, no blood was shed that night. The three men were placed under watch, given food but no weapons, shelter but no trust. Wicasa didn't speak to Clara Ara as he walked away. She found him later, sitting alone near the horses, staring out into the darkness. Why did you stand for me? She asked softly. In the circle. He didn't look at her. Sometimes, he said, his voice flat, mercy is more dangerous than fire. She sat beside him anyway. The baby slept peacefully for once, nestled in her lap. And for the first time, Clara Ara noticed how close Wicasa's hand was resting to hers on the cold ground, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. The next morning, a sharp cry shattered the quiet of the camp. It was Tyre. Her skin was burning with fever. Her breath came in shallow, rapid pants. Clara Ara screamed for help. Inkomis arrived in seconds, but one look at the child and her face turned grave. The root we need, she said, her voice urgent. It grows only near the old river mission. No one has gone that way in years. It is a cursed place. Wicasa didn't wait for another word. He just stood and walked toward his horse. The scream tore through the camp before the sun had even cleared the treetops. It was Clara Ara's voice, a raw, guttural sound of pure terror that shattered the morning silence like a bone snapping under weight. Her tent flap flew open and she stumbled out, her eyes wild. We was in her arms, crying, but it was the other baby, silent and limp against her chest, that drew every eye. Tyre's burning, she choked out, her words tumbling over each other. She won't cry. She won't open her eyes. Inkomis pushed past her, already calling for water, for herbs, for any hands that could help. Wicasa was there in a flash, his boots crunching through the frost, a knife half drawn from pure instinct. But when he saw the look on Clara Ara's face, the blade slid back into its sheath. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the smell of fever. Tyre's skin was slick, glowing with an unnatural flush that didn't belong to life. Her tiny chest rose and fell in frantic stutters. Her eyelids fluttered like leaves caught in a storm. She's too small, Inkomis muttered, pressing her palm against the girl's brow. Her body fights, but the fire inside is older than she is. Clara Ara dropped to her knees on the cold dirt floor. Do something, she begged, please. I have done all I can with what is here, Inkomis said, her voice grim. She needs Iskal root. Wicasa tensed. That root only grows in the north. The elder nodded, her eyes dark with worry. Near the old mission by the river, past the hills, beyond the Tonkawa border. Clara Ara's head snapped up. I'll go. And Comus didn't even bother to answer her. You'll never make it, Wicasa said, his voice flat but not unkind. Not with the boy. Not with the snow still deep in the passes. I can't just sit here and watch her die. I'll go, he said simply. She stared at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with disbelief. You don't have to do this. I do. Don't do it for me, she said, her voice cracking. Do it for the cry you heard that night, the one that told you she was alive. He looked down at Tyre, who whimpered weakly, a mere ghost of the wail that had once pierced the winter wind. He gave a single, sharp nod. I heard her, and then he was gone. He rode hard, pushing his horse through a land that was cruel and unforgiving this time of year. Sharp winds cut through the canyons, hidden patches of ice lay like traps on the trail, and entire paths were still buried beneath drifts of old snow. But Wicasa didn't slow. Not when the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Not when the ancient pine trees groaned under the weight of the ice. Not even when a hidden root twisted his horse's leg, nearly sending them both tumbling down a ravine. He pushed on. By the time the sun began to bleed behind the trees, his breath was a thick cloud of steam. His fingers were raw, his coat stiff with frozen sweat and melting snow. He reached the river just after dusk. The old French mission stood crooked against the fading sky, a skeleton of a building. Its bell tower was broken, its wooden door hanging by a single rusted hinge. A faint curl of smoke rose from its side chimney. Someone was there. Wicasa dismounted, moving with a predator's caution, one hand resting on the hilt of his belt knife. Inside, it was warmer than he expected. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth. The room smelled of sour wine, old leather, and decay. And in the corner, wrapped in a moth-eaten blanket, sat a man. He was older than Wicasa remembered hearing in the stories, with a long, matted beard and eyes that were cloudy but still sharp. A tarnished silver cross hung from his neck. Father Devo, Wicasa said, his voice a low rumble. The priest blinked slowly like an owl. You are Lakota? Yes. You come here alone. This is not a place for visitors. I need Iskal root, Wicasa said, cutting straight to the point. A child will die without it. The old man coughed, a wet rattling sound. You're the first of your people to come here in many years. Most think I died with the mission. Not yet. The priest offered a weak ghost of a smile. No, not yet. Wicasa moved closer. The root. Devo nodded toward a locked wooden cabinet against the far wall. Behind that door, dried and ground, enough for a small child. Wicasa crossed the room, found a key dangling from a rusty nail, and unlocked the cabinet. Inside were dusty bottles, scraps of parchment, and at the very back, a small bundle wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. He opened it gently. The sharp, bitter smell of the root hit him instantly. He turned back. Thank you. Devo nodded. The child, she is yours? Wicasa paused. Then he said, She is now. The priest leaned his head back against the cold stone, his eyes closing. That is how it always is, he whispered. They become ours when we decide not to leave them. Wicasa left a pouch of dried meat and his own fresh flask of water beside the fire. It was all he had to give. Then he was back in the saddle, riding fast, riding hard, carrying a tiny bundle of hope that was smaller than his fist. The storm hit without warning. By the time he reached the southern trail, the wind had turned violent. Snow slashed sideways, blinding him. His horse, already injured, began to limp badly. He had no choice. He dismounted and walked beside it, one hand gripping the reins, the other clutching the precious pouch tight inside his coat. At some point, he stopped feeling his fingers, then his knees, but still, he walked. The fire inside him, the one ignited by a baby's cry in the snow, refused to go out. Back at the camp, Clara didn't sleep. She sat with Tyre wrapped in every hide she owned, rocking slowly, singing old lullabies in a voice gone hoarse with fear. We had cried himself to sleep hours ago. Mika checked on her twice, her presence a silent, solid comfort. And Comis never left her side. The elder kept the fire burning, whispering prayers between long, tense silences. He should be back by now, Clara whispered sometime near dawn, her hope starting to fray. He should have returned, and Comis didn't answer. She just added another piece of wood to the fire. Outside, the wind howled like a legion of ghosts. Then a shout, a voice cutting through the storm. "Ryder!" Clara bolted upright. She flung open the tent flap just in time to see him. Wicasa stumbled through the snow, a phantom coated in blood and ice. His face was cut, his arms were slashed, and one side of his coat had been ripped clean off. But he was holding the pouch. Behind him, his faithful horse finally collapsed into the snow. Clara ran to him, catching him as he fell to his knees. "You're hurt," she breathed, seeing the deep gashes on his arm. "But she will live," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He held up the root, his hand trembling violently. And Comis snatched it from his grasp and disappeared into the tent without a word. Clara wrapped her arms around him, trying to steady him, to lend him her strength. He sagged against her, his body burning with a feverish cold and sheer exhaustion. "You came back," she whispered into his frozen hair. His voice was a ghost of a sound. "She called me father." "What?" Clara pulled back, confused. But he didn't answer. His eyes fluttered shut, and he went limp in her arms. Comis worked quickly, brewing the bitter root into a tea. Tyre drank it drop by agonizing drop. By nightfall, her fever broke. She opened her eyes, and then she smiled. It was a weak, toothless, perfect smile. Clara cried silently, tears of sheer, overwhelming relief streaming down her face. Wicasa slept for 2 full days. When he finally woke, his arm had been bandaged, his wounds cleaned and dressed. Clara was sitting beside him, gently brushing his damp hair back from his brow. "If you hadn't come back," she began, her voice thick with emotion. He didn't let her finish. "You called her ours," he said, his voice still rough. Clara froze. "In your voice," he continued, his eyes fixed on hers. "When you told me to go, I heard it." She didn't deny it. She couldn't. Instead, she reached out and took his good hand in hers. He didn't pull away. They sat in silence as the fire warmed their feet and the children breathed softly nearby. Outside, the storm had finally passed. The land was quiet again. But inside them, something new had just begun to stir. The next morning, Mika entered the tent without knocking. She glanced at the sleeping babies, then at the 2 of them sitting side by side, their hands still touching. She looked at Clara. "You should come outside." "Why?" A rare, small smile touched Mika's lips. "Because the snow is melting," she said, "and they want to see if you will stand." The snow was breaking. It didn't melt all at once. It gave way in patches, a slow, reluctant surrender where the strengthening sunlight touched the earth like a half-forgotten memory. Clara stepped out of the tent with Wee and Tyre bundled against her chest. The weight of them, once a burden of fear, was now an anchor that grounded her to this place. Her boots squished in the soft mud that lay hidden beneath the old snow. The camp smelled different. It smelled damp, alive. Pine, wood smoke, and the rich scent of the thaw. People were moving again, not just surviving, but living. She saw children chasing each other between the tents, their laughter echoing as they slipped and slid in the puddles. Women were hanging damp hides over racks to dry in the sun. Men were repairing tools, sharpening blades that had been dulled by the long, hard winter. When she passed, not everyone turned away this time. Some of them looked at her and nodded. A small gesture, but it felt monumental. One woman, the same one who had mocked her fire-making efforts weeks ago, handed her a piece of fresh bread still warm from the fire. Clara Ara blinked, stunned. For me? The woman shrugged, a flicker of a smile on her weathered face. For the girl who fought death, she said, and won. Clara Ara took it with a shaking hand, mumbled her thanks, and walked on, her heart full. That evening, Wicasa sat just outside his tent, sharpening the edge of his old hatchet with a smooth, rhythmic motion. His arm was still bandaged. Clara Ara approached quietly, still unsure if the space between them belonged to their shared silence or something new. He didn't look up when she sat beside him. She waited. Finally, he spoke. "They're louder now." She knew he meant the twins. "They're finding their voices," she said softly. He nodded. They were born to be loud. A small smile touched Clara Ara's lips. "You saved her." "No," he replied, his voice low. "She saved me." Clara Ara turned to him, confused. "Why do you say that?" He placed the hatchet down carefully and wiped the blade on a piece of leather. "Because I heard her call me father," he said, meeting her eyes. She did not say the word, but I heard it. The words hit her harder than she expected, not because they were dramatic, but because they were quiet, and they were true. Later that week, Mika brought Clara Ara a small woven pouch. Inside was a collection of small things, fragrant herbs, a comb carved from bone, a beaded cord for her hair. "What's this?" Clara Ara asked. "Belongings," Mika said simply. "It means you have a place here now." Clara Ara blinked back tears. "Thank you." Mika glanced toward the twins, who were gurgling happily in a basket near the fire. "They changed you." "They saved me," Clara Ara corrected her. Mika nodded once. "Then we are the same." Nkomi's called for her to help gather water. The elder didn't speak much as they walked to the stream that bubbled at the edge of the trees. She just handed Clara Ara a pot and walked beside her. Clara Ara had walked this path before, once, limping, dragging herself, half dead. Now she carried 2 flasks, balanced and breathing. As they filled the pots with cold, clear water, Nkomis asked a simple question. "You still wish to leave?" Clara Ara looked around at the pines, at the smoke curling from the camp, at the tracks in the mud. She shook her head. "No," she said. "I don't think there's anywhere else left for me to go." The elder smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened the lines on her face. "Good. Then let your roots grow here." That night, Wicasa taught her more words beside the fire. He drew them in the dirt, and she sounded them out, her tongue still clumsy. Family, water, sun. She pointed at the last one. "That's his name. We." "Yes," he said. He hesitated, then added, "Your words for them. They are not just names. They are prayers." She looked down at the babies, sleeping peacefully. "They were born into a storm. I wanted their names to speak louder than the wind." Wicasa watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. Then he touched his own chest. "Wicasa," he said, "my name means man. But some days, I do not feel like one." She didn't ask him why. She just said, "You don't need to be anything more than what you are." He didn't reply, but a long breath slipped out of him, like a tension he'd been holding for years was finally being released. The camp felt different now. Not just the air, but the people. Eyes met hers instead of avoiding them. Hands reached out to help rather than push away. One morning, Clara Ara heard a group of children repeating her name in a game, laughing as they tried to mimic her accent. She smiled, then gently corrected their pronunciation. They just laughed harder. A few days later, Nkomis held a blessing ceremony for the children who had been born during the winter. Only 2 had survived. We and Tyre. Clara Ara stood beside Wakasa, holding one child in each arm. Nkomis painted a single line of red ochre across each of their foreheads and murmured a prayer to the sun and the river. Then, in front of the entire tribe, she turned to Clara Ara. "They were born strangers to this land," she announced, her voice strong. "But today, we name them children of the wind." A hush fell over the crowd. Mika stepped forward. She held out a small necklace made of sunstone and bone. "Fire," she said to Clara Ara, "to remind you that even the smallest flame can shift mountains." Clara Ara took it, stunned into silence. "It's hers now," Wikasa murmured beside her. Clara Ara looked at him. "And what is yours?" He didn't answer with words. He walked to the fire, lifted a hide-wrapped bundle, and placed it beside her. She opened it slowly. It was a child's coat, handmade, stitched with incredible care. The edges were lined with soft, red fur. "We will need it next winter," he said simply. She blinked fast, fighting back tears. So many little things. So much said without a single word. That night, as the stars pushed their way through the clouds, Clara Ara sat beside the fire, the twins sleeping in her lap. She whispered to no one in particular. "We're not alone anymore." Before she could head back into her tent, a sharp voice yelled from the far edge of the camp. "Riders from the south!" Instantly, people rose to their feet, weapons appearing in their hands. The peaceful atmosphere vanished, replaced by a tense, electric silence. The fires seemed to dim. 3 men stumbled into the circle of torches. They were bloodied, shaking, barely able to stand. Clara Ara's eyes widened in horror. One of them looked familiar, but older, dirtier, broken. The crowd whispered, a low, dangerous sound. Wikasa stood, his hand on his knife. Clara Ara whispered, her voice tight with dread. "What are they doing here?" Mika, standing beside her, answered grimly. "They are not passing through," she said. "They are running." Clara Ara recognized the blood before she recognized the faces. 3 men stumbled into the firelight, their bodies barely upright, their clothes torn and soaked in dried crimson. One clutched his side, a dark stain spreading through his fingers. Another limped heavily, his face a mask of pain. The third, who seemed barely a man anymore, dragged a rifle behind him like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Whispers broke out in the crowd, a low, angry buzz. Wikasa stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, but his eyes were calm, watchful. Clara Ara stood frozen. The tallest of the 3 raised a shaking hand. We're not here to fight," he stammered. "We're running." From behind the fires, Mika's voice cut through the tension, sharp and low. "Running brings danger with it." The man looked around wildly, his eyes filled with a desperate panic. "Please," he begged. "There's no place left. The plains are crawling with Tonkawa. They don't just kill. They carve." Wikasa narrowed his eyes. "Why were you in their land?" "We were just passing through. Traders. Honest," the man insisted. "But one of us, he shot a deer. Too close to their sacred grounds. They came after us. They won't stop until we're all dead." Clara Ara stepped closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. And then the third man, the one with the rifle, lifted his head. Time collapsed. It was Elijah. He was thinner, hollow-eyed. The right side of his cheek was caved in where a bone had been broken and healed wrong. His gaze met hers, and for a split second something flickered in his eyes. Then he looked away. "You," she whispered, the sound stolen by the wind. Mika leaned in close, her voice meant only for Clara Ara. "You know him?" Clara Ara could only nod. "He was there when Rafe left me, when they turned the wagon around and rode away." Mika's jaw flexed, a single muscle twitching in her cheek. and now he wants to warm himself at your fire." "I don't care what he wants," Clara Ara murmured, her eyes still locked on Elijah's bent head. "I care what I become if I let him freeze to death." That night, the three men were given minimal shelter, a simple lean-to at the very edge of the camp, guarded by two Lakota sentries. They were given no weapons, no fire of their own. Clara Ara didn't sleep. She held Tyre and weak clothes, their warmth a small comfort as she stared at the smoke rising through the top of her tent. Wakasa sat with her, his presence a silent anchor in the dark. "You cannot save everyone," he said softly. "No," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "But I can choose who I become by how I respond to those who once left me to die." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mercy is not weakness, Clara Ara, but mercy without memory is just blindness." The next morning, Nkomi summoned the tribal council. The newcomers were brought to the center of the camp, forced to kneel in the dirt. Dozens of Lakota stood in a silent circle, their faces grim, their judgment palpable. Winga spoke first. "You brought your blood to our border. Why should we not return you to the snow?" Elijah didn't speak, but the tall one did. "We've stolen nothing. We've taken no food. Just give us 2 days to rest. Then we'll move on." Mika turned to Clara Ara. "Say your piece." Clara Ara stepped forward, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. She looked at the kneeling men, then at the faces in the circle. "They left me to die in the desert," she said, her voice clear and steady. "They stole my water. They took my horse. One of them laughed as they rode away." A low murmur of anger rippled through the circle. Winga raised a hand for silence. "And yet," he said, his eyes fixed on her, "you do not ask for their death." Clara Ara looked at Elijah. He still wouldn't meet her gaze. "I do not ask for revenge," she said, "but I do ask for truth." She walked straight up to Elijah, stopping just inches from him. "Kneel if you remember me," she said quietly, her voice for him alone. He didn't move. Clara Ara's heart sank. She turned to walk away. Then he dropped. He fell to both knees, the movement slow, shaking, not from pain, but from a shame that seemed to crush him from the inside out. "I was wrong," Elijah rasped, his voice raw. "We were all wrong." Wakasa stepped forward. "Say what you mean," he commanded. "Do not let her carry your apology." Elijah finally looked up, his eyes meeting Clara Ara's. They were filled with a profound, soul-deep regret. "I left her to die," he said, his voice cracking, "and I have regretted it every day since." Winga watched him for a long, silent moment. Then he asked Clara Ara, "Do you forgive him?" Clara Ara closed her eyes. A memory flashed behind them, her own body lying in the blood-soaked snow, the twins not yet crying. Then another image, Wakasa on horseback, his strong arms around her, carrying her toward fire, toward life. She opened her eyes again. "I don't know if I forgive him," she said honestly, "but I do not want to see him die." The chief nodded once. It was decided. "They will not stay," he announced to the tribe, "but they will walk away fed, clothed, and unarmed. And they will carry with them the story of a woman who should have cursed them, but chose not to." Later that day, Clara Ara found Elijah alone at the river's edge, trying to wash the dried blood from his hands. He looked up as she approached. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said. "Just remember me right this time." He nodded. Then he asked, "That man who saved you, the Lakota, does he know what you have been through?" Clara Ara looked across the river, where Wakasa stood with Wee in his arms, bouncing him gently. "Yes," she said, "and more." A faint, sad smile touched Elijah's lips. "Then you are luckier than most." He stood and walked away without asking for anything more. That night, Wakasa and Clara Ara sat by the fire again, as they had every night since the thaw began. He was quieter than usual. Finally, he asked, "If it had been me, kneeling in that circle, would you have spoken the same words for me?" She turned to him, surprised by the question. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Even after all this." Clara Ara reached out and took his hand. "You were not the one who left," she said softly. "You were the one who returned." The next morning the riders left. No one waved, but no arrows followed them. That was enough. The camp was quiet again, peaceful, until the hawk call sounded from the ridge. It was sharp, urgent, a warning. Mika burst into Clara Ara's tent, her breath short, her eyes wide with alarm. "Riders!" she gasped. "Real ones! Tonkawa! And they are armed for war!" Clara Ara instinctively clutched her children tighter. Wakasa was already on his feet, grabbing his bow without a word. Mika looked at Clara Ara, her expression a mixture of fear and resolve. "You do not have to fight. Take the children and hide." Clara Ara met her gaze, her own eyes blazing with a fire Mika had never seen before. "I did not survive the desert," she said, "just to die in the grass." The sky turned to copper just before they arrived, not gold, not orange. Copper, heavy, ominous, as if the clouds themselves were holding their breath. Wakasa stood at the southern edge of the camp, his bow in hand, his eyes narrowed to slits. Mika was beside him, her hatchet drawn, her jaw locked tight. The other Lakota warriors fanned out in a silent, deadly arc, their weapons ready, their hearts steadier than they had any right to be. Clara Ara was not behind them. She stood with them. She had wrapped Wee and Tyre close against her chest, tied them tight inside a buffalo hide sling, and handed the precious bundle to Encomus. Her hands did not shake. "They are yours until I return," Clara Ara had said, her voice steady. Encomus had nodded once, her ancient eyes filled with a fierce pride. "Do not come back dead." Clara Ara had offered a faint smile. "I'm not the dying kind anymore." The Tonkawa came swift and silent. 10 riders, their faces painted for battle, their arrows already knocked on their bowstrings. They didn't speak, they didn't parley, they just charged. The Lakota held their line. And Clara Ara, standing near the second row, a stolen blade in each hand, felt the familiar sting of fear. But it didn't own her anymore. Not like it had in the canyon or under the wagon or in the terrifying silence after her babies first cried. Now, fear was just fuel. The first clash was like thunder. Wakasa's arrow found its mark before the first rider even crossed the snow-bare ridge. Mika dropped the second with a clean, powerful throw of her hatchet that was so precise it made the other attackers pause for a split second in their gallop. That was all the opening they needed. Clara Ara moved when instinct told her to. Not bravely, but boldly. The man who came for her swung a crooked saber, aiming for her head. She ducked low and fast, the blade slicing the empty air above her. Her own knife came up, catching him in the side. It wasn't a deep cut, but it was deep enough. He screamed, a high, surprised sound, and toppled from his horse. She didn't watch him fall. She was already turning to face the next threat. By the time the dust settled, it was over. 3 Lakota had wounds, but none were fatal. 5 Tonkawa lay dead in the mud. The rest had fled, vanishing back into the hills without another sound. Afterward, Clara Ara stood in the middle of the field, mud clinging to her boots, blood smearing her arms. Some of it was hers, some was not. Her breath came in slow, heavy pants, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. A profound, bone-deep realization of what she had just done. Wakasa approached, his hands still wrapped around his bow. "You stood," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. Clara Ara didn't look at him at first. She just stared down at her own hands, at the blades she still held. Then she said, "I didn't know I could." He nodded slowly. "You did more than stand." She turned then and finally met his gaze. "You saved the camp," he said. "No," she replied, a sudden, fierce certainty in her voice. "The camp saved me." The burial was quiet. The sun lowered itself behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Smoke curled from the ceremonial fires. The children were not told the details, just that danger had come, and it had been met, and it had passed. Clarara watched Wee and Tai sleep that night, the weight of the battle sitting just beneath her ribs like a second heartbeat. But for the first time, the weight didn't hurt. It just reminded her that she was alive, still here. Spring broke the earth wide open. Wildflowers, bright and defiant, pushed their way through the snow-cracked mud. The river ran louder, swollen with meltwater. The trees budded, a haze of pale green spreading across the hills. Clarara sat outside her tent, carving a small piece of wood with steady, focused hands. Wicasa watched her. His leg was wrapped tight with fresh bandages from a wound he'd taken in the fight. He had a child balanced on either side of him, both of them reaching for his long hair. "Do you think the land remembers?" she asked quietly, not looking up from her work. "The pain, the battles, the blood?" He looked out at the healing land. "Maybe," he said, "but it remembers the healing too." She smiled, then held up her carving. It was a sun, simple and round, with flames curling outward, carved into a piece of soft birchwood. "For we," she said. Then she pulled a second piece from her coat. It was a gust of wind, depicted in long, swirling lines. "For Tyre." He took them from her, running his thumb along the smooth grooves. "You gave them names," he said, "and now you give those names meaning." Weeks later, the council gathered again. This time it wasn't about outsiders or war or survival. It was about land and people and place. Clarara was called to speak, not as a witness, but as a voice. She stood in the center of the camp, in the exact same spot where she had once arrived covered in blood and frost. Now she stood clean, steady, and whole. "I came here broken," she said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I was carried, not walking. I was cursed, not chosen. I did not expect to find a fire. I did not expect to be saved." She looked around, meeting the eyes of the people who had become her world. "But the fire here did not burn me. It forged me." The tribe did not applaud. They did not cheer. But one by one, they nodded. And in the Lakota way, that meant more than anything. That night, as the stars pulled a blanket of diamond dust over the horizon, Clarara sat beside Wicasa, watching the embers of their fire glow. "They will grow up with 2 languages," she whispered. He nodded. "They will grow up knowing where they came from and where they belong." "Will they be Lakota?" she asked. "Will they be what I was?" He shrugged, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "They will be whatever they decide to be," he said. "But they will never be alone." The story didn't end in blood, or in fire, or in revenge. It ended here, with quiet names, with deep roots, with the promise of new seasons, and the message it carried was simple, human, and unshakable. Home is not the place where you were born. It's the place where someone chooses to stay when the storm comes. And it's the place you choose to stand and fight for long after that storm has passed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what you think Clarara's greatest strength was. We'll see you in the next one.